A while back, I posted a video on the channel showing how much time Franklin would spend in prison if he were tried for all the crimes he committed, and in today's video we're doing the same thing with Trevor, using California laws to judge every crime he's committed, from his past when he was younger and underage, to later on, including all the crimes he pulled before the prologue, during the prologue, after the prologue, and throughout the entire GTA 5 story, including events in GTA Online. And guys, I bet you can't guess how much time this dude would actually do. Prison time, life sentences, fines, and all that. Here's what you do. Drop a comment below with how much time you think he'd get, and at the end of the video you'll see if you were close or way off. No editing your comments, okay? Edited comments won't count. With that said, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let's get started. Let's start by talking about the time when Trevor was a minor, because yeah, he was already committing some crimes back then. The first crime he committed as a minor was, in a way, animal cruelty when he was young. We're going to judge this based on California laws, but Trevor's childhood wasn't in California, alright? Since I'm not exactly sure where it was, we'll use these laws, okay? So the charge would be animal cruelty with possible penalties as a minor, like being sent to juvenile court probation, up to 3 years in jail, and a fine of up to $20,000. Next, there's another crime he says he also committed, which was killing some homeless people. He mentions this at the same time he says he also killed animals, and in this case, even though he was a minor, he would be tried as an adult. It would be second-degree murder charges with a possible sentence per victim of 15 years to life in prison. Or depending on the judge, he could have a juvenile trial with detention until he reaches adulthood, and a possible fine of up to $10,000. A third crime he committed while he was still a minor was an attack on his hockey coach. He himself describes it as an extremely serious assault, in a way, against the coach, which seems to be a sexual crime, since he supposedly put the hockey stick up the coach's ass. At least that's how I understood it. And the charge in this case would be aggravated assault, with a penalty of up to 4 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. He also claims at another point that he already killed a musician, strangling him with his own clarinet. In this case, it would be second-degree murder, with a possible sentence of 15 years up to life in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. And his last crime while he was a minor was setting fire to the shopping mall. According to him, at one point in his life, he went back to the mall where his dad had supposedly abandoned him and set the whole place on fire. The charge in this case would be arson, with a possible sentence of up to 9 years in prison and a fine of up to $50,000, plus compensation for reconstruction and all that. Now moving on to a point in Trevor's life when he's already an adult. There are several sequences of gas station robberies. There's no exact number, we only know he did this while traveling through the countryside. So here we'll assume there were just 5 confirmed robberies involving armed robbery. In this case, Trevor would use firearms to intimidate employees and steal money from the store. With the possible charge of armed robbery, the potential sentence is up to 9 years in prison per robbery. And in this case, with 5 robberies, we'll assume 45 years in prison. There's also the aggravating factor of using a firearm during a violent crime, which could add up to 10 extra years and a fine of $10,000 per incident, which in this case would be up to $50,000. There would also be a series of homicides that happened during this period, since according to him, many of the robberies always end in death. So we won't confirm an exact number, but let's say that during this phase with the 5 robberies he committed, there were only 3 homicides. We're really lowballing it here because you'll see that even with a low estimate, the total will still be very high later on. With a possible sentence of 15 years to life per victim, since it's second-degree murder, that would mean 3 life sentences plus a possible $10,000 fine per homicide, which would total up to $30,000. A bit later in Trevor's life, he starts working with smuggling and hauling shady air cargo. So before the big heists with Michael, Trevor used his pilot skills to move suspicious shipments by air along the US-Canada border. Let's keep the estimate really conservative here and only count the illegal transport of cargo without authorization. In that case, he'd be charged with illegal air transport operations, which can carry up to 5 years in federal prison and a possible fine of up to $250,000. But at the event where he meets Michael, he himself says there were a few more things, including some deaths. In this case, he makes it clear that he killed a man with a flare gun, shooting him right in the eye. That would be second-degree murder, which carries from 15 years to life in prison and a $10,000 fine. But there's an aggravating factor here, the concealment of a corpse. After the death, Trevor and Michael take the body and dump it in a lake, which would lead to a charge of corpse concealment, adding 3 more years in prison. Plus there's a charge for destroying evidence, which could add another 3 years and a $10,000 fine. After Trevor met Michael, they started hitting up various places with robberies. In one of those spots, Trevor robbed a check cashing store. He got caught, convicted, and sentenced to 6 months in prison, but he only served 4 months. So I won't count that in the final total since he basically already served that sentence. After that, we'll tally up other robberies that might have happened with Michael and Trevor, and Lester too, since he was already part of the crew back then, but also daylight murders, because at one point, Michael says they had to keep moving from city to city after the heist since Trevor kept killing people out in the open. So So let's assume Trevor killed 5 people during that time. Honestly, that's a pretty conservative estimate, but if it's 5 victims, he'd be facing an impossible sentence of 15 years to life per victim. That's 5 life sentences with possible fines up to $10,000 per victim, adding up to $50,000, and that's just in the period after he met Michael, before the North Yankton heist. When they get to the North Yankton heist part, there are the following charges. The first would be the armed robbery of a money depot. Even though the heist happens in North Yankton, we're going to keep the same calculation standard, using California laws as a comparative basis. And here, for armed robbery, the sentence is up to 9 years in prison, plus a possible fine of up to $10,000. There's also the death of the security guard during the robbery, since Trevor kills the guard who was holding Michael at gunpoint. And that, in practice, is homicide during a robbery, which leads to the charge of homicide during a violent crime with a sentence ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment plus a possible fine of up to $10,000. After that, there's the crime of resisting arrest and the death of several police officers because after the alarm goes off, Trevor takes part in a heavy shootout against the cops and dozens of officers could have died there. We'll count that Trevor killed only 10 of them, not the full dozens, and the rest were left for Michael or the rest of the crew. In this case, it would be homicide of a law enforcement officer with a possible sentence per victim of 25 years to life imprisonment, and assuming there's up to $10,000 in fines per victim, that would be up to another $100,000 in possible fine. Along with this crime, there would also be resisting arrest since he fights the attempt to arrest him during the escape, which would add another year in prison and a possible fine of up to $1,000. And just to wrap up this North Yankton part, there's also the crime of property damage because during the getaway and the shootout, vehicles, structures, and properties get destroyed. Now, I'm not going to list the destruction for each item individually. Let's just count it all at once as a possible charge of vandalism or criminal destruction of property, with a penalty of up to 3 years in prison, a fine of up to $10,000, plus compensation for the damages caused and reimbursement to owners and insurance companies. After the events back in North Yankton where Trevor managed to escape and all that, he starts kidnapping and killing a lot of hitchhikers. Lester himself mentions this to Michael, saying Trevor would be wherever he was, in liquor stores, and people were disappearing. So let's assume these were kidnappings and he could either kill these people or maybe take them to the altruist cult. Since we don't know their whereabouts, let's conclude it was kidnapping and homicide. The possible sentence for kidnapping is up to 8 years per victim. Let's assume just 2 confirmed victims here, which would be 16 years in prison, plus the homicide sentence per victim, which ranges from 15 years to life imprisonment, meaning 2 life sentences plus up to $10,000 per victim. Shortly after that, Trevor meets Chef, and during a meeting where Trevor is basically interviewing Chef and checking out his skills, they kill a gold buyer and his bodyguard, dismember the bodies, bury the remains in a junkyard, and keep about 50 grand. In this case, it would be a double second-degree murder charge with a penalty of 15 years to life per victim, meaning 2 life sentences and a possible fine up to $20,000. On top of that, there's concealment of a corpse since the bodies were dismembered and buried, with a possible sentence of up to 3 years for destroying evidence and another 3 years for obstruction of justice. Also, since Trevor keeps $50,000 from that deal that belonged to those guys, he'd get an additional 3 years in prison and a possible fine up to $10,000. After officially sealing the partnership with Chef, he creates Trevor Phillips Enterprises, where now he runs a criminal organization mainly focused on meth production and distribution. The charge he'd face here would be manufacturing a controlled substance carrying up to 7 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $50,000. Then he'd also face another charge for distribution and trafficking of methamphetamine, which would mean an additional 9 years in prison and another possible $50,000 in fines. One of the things Trevor Phillips Enterprises also did was arms smuggling, so he was also involved in arms trafficking, which could lead to up to 10 years of federal prison and a possible fine of up to $250,000. Shortly after, Trevor meets Wade and his friends, who were about 5 people. Those 5 go with Trevor to the quarry and none of them come back. So let's assume 5 confirmed deaths caused by Trevor, which would carry a possible sentence per victim of 15 years to life in prison, plus a possible fine of up to $50,000, $10,000 per victim. After that, Trevor hides this version of the story from Wade and pretends they all just left. Then he starts abusing Wade while also pretending to be his friend. Trevor even assaults Wade with a hockey stick, just like he did with his teacher when he was younger. In this case, he'd face a charge of aggravated assault with a possible sentence of up to 4 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. Now let's talk a bit about Trevor's stint in GTA Online, where he runs operations to buy, steal, transport, and sell drugs. In this case, he'd be charged with organizing trafficking of controlled substances, which carries up to 9 years in prison plus a fine of up to $50,000. There's also the theft of drugs from rival factions, since Trevor orders the GTA Online player to steal drugs from gangs like Lost MC, Vagos, and Ballast. That would be criminal property theft, adding up to 3 more years in prison. And also conspiracy to commit murder, because during these operations, Trevor instructs the player to eliminate eliminate dealers and members of rival gangs. To keep it conservative, let's count only 5 deaths attributed to his orders, which would bring a conspiracy to murder charge with a possible sentence per victim of 15 years, life imprisonment, and fines up to $50,000. That's $10,000 per victim. There was also aerial smuggling, since Trevor used planes to transport drugs, weapons, and illegal cargo. That would add 5 more years of federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. There was also shooting down rival aircraft, since Trevor orders the player to take down planes from rival factions during smuggling runs, which could mean up to 20 years in federal prison and a possible fine of up to $250,000. And if crew members died, that could lead to new homicide charges too. But to keep it conservative, we won't add any homicides here. There would also be the crime of transporting a large quantity of drugs, because there's one crime for just transporting drugs and another for transporting a large amount. During this drug heist, Trevor coordinates the transport of a large quantity of stolen narcotics, which would get him charged with drug trafficking with intent to distribute, adding 9 more years in prison and up to $50,000 in fines. Besides the clashes with rival gangs trying to get the drugs back when shootouts and all that happen, Trevor acts as the organizer and person in charge of the operation. In a conservative estimate, we count 5 deaths linked to him, which could mean possibly 5 more life sentences or 15 additional years per victim, plus $10,000 in fines per victim. Finally, in Trevor's GTA Online operations, there's the escape from the federal operation, because at the end of the mission, it turns into a full-on federal police ambush. Trevor runs from the scene to avoid arrest, which would lead to charges of fleeing a police or federal operation, with a penalty of up to 3 years in prison and possible fines up to $10,000, plus obstruction of investigation, since by fleeing a federal operation and continuing to hide the criminal setup, Trevor could also be charged with obstruction. And in this case, obstruction of justice could mean up to 5 years in prison and possible fines up to $250,000. Now moving to the beginning of GTA 5 to the start of Trevor's campaign in GTA 5, we already begin with sexual exploitation in exchange for drugs, because before Trevor's confrontation with Johnny, the game makes it clear that Trevor has a relationship with Ashley linked to drug use and addiction. So basically, we're setting up a conservative scenario here. The safest charge would be to consider sexual exploitation through coercion tied to drug distribution, which would lead to a charge of sexual exploitation by coercion or drug supply, with up to 5 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. After that, we have the assault and death of Johnny Klebitz, after Johnny confronts Trevor over Ashley. And even though it might seem like self-defense, Johnny didn't pose a real threat to Trevor, so Trevor's reaction is completely over the top. Because of that, the self-defense claim pretty much falls apart, turning it into aggravated assault, which could bring up to 4 years in prison plus a fine of up to $10,000, and homicide, which could mean 15 years to life behind bars. To prevent retaliation, Trevor goes on to wipe out the Lost MC, since he decides to directly attack the Lost MC at their camp, including some key figures, to lower the chance of an immediate counterattack. In a conservative scenario, let's say Trevor killed only 10 people, not the maximum possible number, which would amount to 10 life sentences or up to 150 years in prison, plus $10,000 in fines per victim. After dealing with the Lost MC, Trevor goes to Ortega's trailer and threatens him. In this case, let's say Ortega was not directly killed by Trevor. At this point, we're only considering the crimes of threat and property destruction, which would lead to a charge of aggravated vandalism or criminal property damage, carrying 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000, plus compensation for the trailer's value and payment for material damages. Then after that, we have the charge of criminal threat, which could mean up to 3 years in prison and another $10,000 fine. This would be the moment when Trevor is threatening Ortega but doesn't kill him and lets him live. Right after that, Trevor forces Wade, kind of intimidating him, to dig up info on Michael and threatens him when he doesn't get quick answers. This would count as criminal threat or intimidation, which carries up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After that, in the mission Nervous Ron, there's the theft of a rifle from Amu Nation, because Trevor goes there and gets a rifle using threats and intimidation, making it clear that the store owner says the place had already been burned down and all, but we're not including that in the count here. This would lead to a charge of firearm theft, punishable by up to 9 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. Next up is the attack on the Lost MC with Ron, where Trevor uses the rifle to cover Ron during the assault at Sandy Shores Airport, where dozens of soldiers are killed. But let's keep it conservative here and assume only 10 deaths directly caused by Trevor. That would bring second-degree murder charges, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life imprisonment per victim, which means 10 life sentences and up to $100,000 in fines. There's also the helicopter shoot-down in the same mission, which would be charged as aircraft destruction, carrying 20 years of federal prison and up to $250,000 in fines. Then comes the plane theft that happens right after, which would bring aircraft theft charges with 10 years of federal prison plus another $250,000 in fines. And lastly, the air smuggling, since at the end they used the plane to dump some illegal cargo, adding 5 more years of federal prison and another $250,000 in fines. A bit later, Trevor moves forward to negotiate with the Triad's Chinese guys, where everything goes wrong with Tao Sheng and his translator. Then, during that visit, the lab gets attacked by the Aztecas, and the meeting turns into a full-on shootout. Tao Sheng and the translator hide inside the ice machine, which could be seen as unlawful imprisonment or illegal deprivation of freedom. Even though it was for a short time and meant to protect them, Trevor wouldn't have that right, so that would mean 3 years in prison and a fine up to $10,000. There's also the armed defense of the meth lab when they're fighting back, which would count as using a firearm in defense of a criminal operation, carrying up to 10 years in prison and a fine up to $10,000. Then there's the Aztecas massacre during this gang fight, and in a conservative scenario, let's just consider 10 deaths, which would be 15 years to life per victim, adding up to 10 life sentences and fines up to $100,000. After all that mess and freeing Tao Sheng and everything, a little further ahead, Trevor meets up with Tao Sheng again, and they end up having a disagreement because the deal doesn't go through. And right then, Trevor attacks Tao Sheng and hits his head on that wooden pillar, which would lead to charges of criminal threat and physical assault, carrying up to 4 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Next, after that fallout with Tao Sheng and his translator, Trevor heads straight to the O'Neill brothers' ranch, where one of the most violent missions in the whole campaign takes place. He raids the ranch alone, kills practically everyone present there, and then sets fire to both the lab and the property. He'd start with the crime of trespassing on the property, which could bring up to 6 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. There's also the murder of the O'Neill members. Here I'll use a conservative minimum of 20 killed, which would add up to 20 more life sentences and $10,000 per victim, potentially reaching $200,000. Then there's the arson of the lab, which would be charged as criminal arson with 9 years in prison and a fine up to $50,000. And the fire at the ranch and property would also count as aggravated arson, adding another 9 years in prison and $50,000 more, plus civil consequences like compensation for the property's value, environmental damage, and the cost of the firefighting operation. After destroying the O'Neill brothers' ranch, Trevor finds out that the Lost MC are still causing trouble for his operation, so he heads to Stab City and takes out all the remaining resistance. Before going to Los Santos, he completely destroys their camp, killing, let's keep it conservative here, 20 people as well, which would mean at least 20 more life sentences and up to $200,000 in fines. Along with that, he blows up the entire camp. At least 5 trailers are totally exploded, so trailers, vehicles, equipment, and other structures get destroyed right there. Since the attack was intentional and carried out with explosives, the most fitting charges here would be aggravated arson and destruction of property, which would bring 9 years in prison and fines of up to $50,000. So after arriving in Los Santos, as soon as he finds out that Michael is alive and everything, Trevor starts living in Floyd's apartment, and the first crime he commits in Los Santos is illegally occupying the apartment. Although Floyd allows him to stay out of fear, the situation is clearly coercive since Trevor is scaring the guy, so the correct charge wouldn't be breaking and entering, but intimidation and coercion to obtain housing, which would carry 3 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. Next, when he meets up with Michael and they go on the show Fame or Shame, Trevor steals a truck to chase after Laszlo. Since the vehicle is taken by force and used without permission, he would face the charge of stealing a heavy commercial vehicle with a possible sentence of up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. There would also be reckless driving charges because after stealing the truck, he drives across Los Santos chasing Laszlo. Here he'd be charged with dangerous driving, which carries 1 year in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. And to wrap up this part, we have the crime of humiliation, intimidation, and recording of Laszlo, which would initially be charged as criminal coercion since Trevor uses direct intimidation to force Laszlo to act against his will. That would mean 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Plus there's the charge of criminal threat since Trevor makes explicit threats of physical violence, adding another 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. And finishing this part about Laszlo, there's the non-consensual recording for embarrassment or harassment, which carries up to 1 year in prison and a fine of up to $1,000. After that, Trevor goes back to Floyd's apartment where he starts getting ready for the Los Santos port heist. To do this, he forces Floyd to help him by sneaking into the port using a fake ID and spends days spying on the company's operations. Even though there are fewer homicides during this phase, there are several federal crimes. The first is coercion of Floyd, since Trevor forces him to take him to the port and assist in the operation. This would lead to a charge of criminal coercion with 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. There's also the use of stolen or cloned uniforms since they're identical to the port workers' gear, which would count as fraudulent use of a professional uniform, carrying up to 3 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. Then there's the crime of false identity because throughout all this spying, Trevor poses as a dock worker, which would lead to a false identity charge with a possible sentence of up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After that, Trevor starts watching the cargo, schedules, ships, and movements of Merryweather. And what does he do? do. And what does he do? He takes photos and sends them to Ron, since his ultimate goal is to gather info for a future heist, which would result in an industrial espionage charge with a possible sentence of up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $50,000, plus trespassing in restricted areas, since he's in parts of the port he's not authorized to be in, which would add another 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. And before leaving the port, Trevor steals confidential documents, which would lead to a charge of theft of confidential information with a possible sentence of up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $50,000. After all that espionage, Trevor starts working directly with Michael on missions organized by the corrupt agents of the FIB. Even though part of the operation is driven by coercion against Michael, Trevor takes part voluntarily and also keeps getting paid for some jobs. Because of that, most of the charges against him still stand. The first one would be for breaking into the IAA building. The mission's goal is to extract Ferdinand, whom he moves out from inside the IAA headquarters. Trevor is involved in the operation from the start, providing support and transportation, which would already bring the charge of breaking into a federal government facility with a possible sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Then there's the kidnapping of Mr. K. Even though the goal was to extract him from the building, in practice it's still kidnapping. So he'd face a kidnapping charge with a possible sentence of up to 8 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Right after that, Trevor escapes piloting the helicopter. Even though he's not the one firing the shots, Michael is. The fact that Trevor is flying the helicopter enables the entire operation, where Michael is using weapons to take down other helicopters. So he'd be charged with being an accomplice to the murder of a federal agent, which carries 15 years to life imprisonment per victim. In a conservative scenario, that's 5 life sentences and a fine of up to $10,000 per victim. And in this case, I'm not even counting the destruction of the helicopters, which would add a much harsher penalty. We're going with a very conservative estimate here. And after completing this heist or kidnapping for the FIB, Trevor keeps the FIB helicopter for himself, turning a government vehicle into stolen property. That would bring a charge of theft of a government aircraft with up to 10 years federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Later on, Trevor meets up with Franklin at his place down in the hood. He then tags along with Franklin and Lamar to what's supposed to be a drug deal on Grove Street. The deal turns out to be a setup, and things quickly escalate into a big shootout involving the Ballas and later the police. The first crime here would be Trevor's direct involvement in the attempted drug buy and sell, even though the product ends up being fake. The people involved believed they were dealing a large amount of drugs, which already shows enough criminal intent, with the charge being conspiracy to traffic drugs, carrying up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $50,000. Next, when the deal goes south, a shootout breaks out with the Ballas. Let's go with a conservative scenario where Trevor only killed 10 people during that shootout with the Ballas. That would mean 15 years to life in prison per victim, plus a fine of up to $10,000 per victim. Following the Ballas, there's also a confrontation with the police where Trevor kills some officers as well. In this case, let's go even more conservative and assume only 2 officers were killed because of Trevor. But since these are law enforcement agents, he'd face charges of killing law enforcement officers, which carry 25 years to life per victim, plus another $10,000 per victim in fines. After the shootout with the police, the jet ski theft happens. To get out of the shootout area, Trevor takes part in stealing some jet skis used for the getaway. Even though they're not cars, they're still motorized vehicles. In this case, that would be charged as motorized vessel theft, with a possible sentence of up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. And the whole point of grabbing the jet ski was to escape the cops, which would also lead to a charge of fleeing the police after a violent crime, adding another 3 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. This $10,000 fine thing is kind of fuzzy, man. Every time it's $10,000 to pay. Then Trevor goes back to doing some jobs for the corrupt agents at the FIB, where this time he has to torture Mr. K, who was captured at the IA building. During this mission, Trevor delivers electric shocks, pulls out teeth, beats the victim, simulates drowning, and causes multiple physical injuries, way beyond a simple assault. This already guarantees a torture charge, with a possible sentence of up to 8 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Plus, there's the aggravated assault charge, since Trevor inflicts serious harm, which could add another 4 years behind bars and an additional fine of up to $10,000. After that, he frees Mr. K and moves on to the Merryweather heist, where the target is a military company holding an extremely dangerous superweapon. Unlike the other missions where Trevor is just a member, here he's the main player in the robbery and plans to sell the gear to Chinese buyers. The first charge he'd face would be theft of military equipment, since no matter how you slice it, the robbery still happens. That alone would bring a charge of stealing military gear or specialized weaponry, with a possible sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Then there would be an aggravating factor in the crime, which is the theft of the super weapon to sell to the Chinese, who are foreign buyers. In this case, it would already lead to a charge of stealing strategic military technology with up to 20 years in federal prison and a possible fine of up to $1 million. And then another one on top of that, which would be the attempt of international trafficking of military technology, resulting in another $1 million fine and 20 more years in federal prison. I don't know, maybe this one and the previous could be added together or calculated differently. During this heist, Trevor is involved, even if indirectly, in the deaths of Merryweather soldiers, which would also bring a charge of homicide during organized crime, with an additional 15 years to life per victim. In a conservative scenario for this heist, we're talking about 10 life sentences and $10,000 per victim, which could easily add up to $100,000. And in this heist's case, I'm considering everything as if it happened perfectly, because even though in the end he returned the super weapon to the ocean due to Lester's pressure, he still committed theft, killed the soldiers, so he still has to answer for those crimes, naturally. After the Merryweather heist fiasco, he moves on to another job with the corrupt agents from the FIB. This time, it's one of the biggest heists for the FIB, which is the mission Blitz Play. The goal is to intercept an armored truck, steal bearer bonds, and deliver everything to Devin Weston. Trevor is involved from the planning all the way to the final robbery. So here we have conspiracy to commit armed robbery, which carries 10 years in prison and up to $50,000 in fines. Theft of high-value financial securities adds another 8 years in prison and up to $250,000 in fines. Attacks on police with an RPG. Since Trevor's in a strategic position using an RPG, it's not just used to escape but to kill and destroy police vehicles, which would lead to charges of using destructive weapons against law enforcement, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a fine up to $50,000. Adding this to the homicides of law enforcement officers, using a conservative estimate, we'll say there are only 5 attempted murders, each carrying up to 15 years per count and a $50,000 fine. Remember, during this heist, there's also the destruction of police helicopters, which Trevor himself destroys, leading to charges of destruction of a police aircraft, punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison plus a possible $250,000 fine. After that, Trevor starts working for Devin Weston, even if indirectly, since he's not the main protagonist in the heist, but he does take part directly in some of the illegal operations. The first crime would be the fake police identity, because in the mission to steal the cheetah car, Trevor disguises himself as a cop to approach the victim without raising suspicion. He used the police uniform and behavior to make the robbery easier, which would lead to a charge of impersonating a police officer, with a possible sentence of up to 3 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. Following that, there's the luxury car theft, which would bring charges of destruction of police aircraft and theft of a high-value vehicle, with up to 5 years in prison and a possible fine of $10,000. After stealing the vehicle, Trevor takes part in an illegal street race with the other protagonist, and these illegal races put other public road drivers at risk, which would lead to a charge of participating in illegal racing, with a possible sentence of up to 1 year in prison and a fine of up to $1,000, plus the charge of reckless driving, adding another 1 year of prison time and an additional $1,000 fine. After dropping off the car at the car wash or the junkyard, I'm not exactly sure what that place is, Trevor takes part in another robbery during the Z-type car mission. He breaks into a police station to get the police vehicle with authorization. He's not actually stealing from anyone, but either way, he's involved in it without any problem. That alone could lead to a possible charge of breaking and entering a police facility with a penalty of up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. There's also the crime of stealing a police helicopter, because even though he initially got permission to take the helicopter, at the end of the mission, Trevor takes the helicopter for himself when he throws the pilot out. Even though that cutscene doesn't exist, Trevor implies it. So in this case, he'd be charged with stealing a police aircraft, carrying a possible federal prison sentence of up to 10 years and a fine of up to $250,000. He would also be charged with illegal surveillance since he uses the equipment from that police vehicle to monitor citizens around Los Santos, which would lead to a charge of illegal electronic surveillance with a penalty of up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $50,000. And after locating the car that was supposed to be stolen, Trevor takes part directly in the operation that results in the theft of the vehicle, which would also make him face a charge of high-value vehicle theft with a penalty of up to 5 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. After helping with that vehicle theft, Martin Madrazo contacts Michael, and Michael calls Trevor to assist with some jobs for Martin Madrazo. During Martin Madrazo's work, Trevor's mission is to collect confidential documents and eliminate a witness. Even though Javier was a member of a criminal organization, that wouldn't change the charge, which would already be second-degree murder, with a possible sentence from 15 years up to life imprisonment and a fine of up to $10,000. On top of that, there's an aggravating factor since it's a witness elimination, with an additional possible sentence of up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up up to $10,000. There would also be the crime of stealing compromising documents, since he takes documents and information belonging to Martin Madrazo. These documents have strategic and private value to the police, which would lead to a charge of theft of private documents with up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Following that, there's the kidnapping of Patricia Madrazo, since Trevor takes Patricia against her will and keeps her on his property for several days. Even though after a while she starts to develop some affection for Trevor, that doesn't erase the original crime. So he would first face a kidnapping charge with a possible sentence of up to 8 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000, and also illegal confinement, since he keeps her there with him for quite some time, which would add another 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. With Trevor and Michael hiding out in Sandy Shores, they start running some operations out there in the countryside, and the first of these operations is the Merriweather plane heist. To pull off this heist in the end, Trevor commits several other crimes beforehand. The first one is stealing an agricultural plane, since he takes a crop duster to kick off the operation. That alone would bring a charge of aircraft theft, with a possible sentence of up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Then there's the collision with the cargo plane, which puts the crew, the cargo, and people on the ground at risk. That would lead to a charge of assault with a flying aircraft, carrying a possible federal sentence of up to 20 years and another potential fine of up to $250,000. As soon as Trevor manages to infiltrate the plane, he kills several Merriweather agents. And here, let's consider a conservative scenario with just 5 agents killed, which would lead to a charge of homicide during a criminal operation. The possible sentence per victim ranges from 15 years to life in prison, which would already mean 5 more life sentences and a $50,000 fine. There's also the murder of the pilot, who wasn't a Merriweather agent but an aircraft pilot, which makes the situation even worse. Considering just one pilot killed, let's say 15 years to life in prison plus $10,000 per victim. After killing the pilot, Trevor fully hijacks the aircraft, and that would be treated as aircraft hijacking or air piracy, which would immediately bring a federal life sentence and a fine of up to $250,000. And since the aircraft is shot down and crashes, causing a major air disaster, he would also face charges for causing an air disaster during a federal crime, which would add another 20 years in prison and an additional fine of up to $250,000. When Trevor gets to the ground, Franklin lets him know that some people are chasing him back in Los Santos or investigating where Trevor might be. So Franklin contacts Trevor, and Trevor helps Franklin take out the last O'Neill brothers. That would already lead to second-degree murder charges with a possible sentence per victim of 15 years to life, which would mean 3 life sentences and a possible fine of up to $30,000. Back in Sandy Shores, they start planning the Paleto Bay heist, and Trevor is involved from the very start of the plan all the way through the final getaway. Unlike Franklin, like I mentioned in the previous video, Trevor isn't just support. He goes into the bank, takes part in the hostage situation, fights the police, and even goes head-to-head with the United States military. First off, he'd be charged with theft of military equipment, which would mean charges for theft and illegal possession of military gear, carrying a possible sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Next, Trevor moves on to the Paleto Bay bank robbery. He's armed, helps take the money, and is part of the whole conspiracy, which leads to armed robbery charges against a financial institution with a possible sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $250,000. During the heist, bank employees and customers are kept under armed threat, and even without direct violence against them, this counts as a hostage situation. This would also bring charges of temporary kidnapping or hostage taking, which could add up to 8 more years of federal prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. After leaving the bank, Trevor gets involved in a massive shootout with the Paleto Bay police. So, conservatively speaking, let's say Trevor killed only 10 officers during that shootout, which is very unlikely. That would mean at least 10 life sentences or 25 years for each officer killed, plus $10,000 per victim. After the police, Trevor goes to war against the army. When the confrontation escalates, Trevor kills several soldiers during the city withdrawal and later before fleeing on the highway. In a conservative scenario, let's say he killed just 10 soldiers as well, which would be military homicide in service, with a possible sentence of 15 years, life imprisonment per victim, adding up to 10 life sentences, and up to $100,000 in fines. During this raid, there's a lot of destruction of properties and public assets, since police vehicles, armored trucks, police barricades, military equipment, and urban infrastructure are all destroyed. Not counting each vehicle separately, we'll group everything here as a single public property charge, which could mean up to 10 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $250,000. With the Paleto Bay heist pulled off right, now the corrupt agents from the FIB have enough funds to carry out the humane lab robbery operation where they're going to extract a toxin that could kill millions of citizens. Even here, the target isn't money, gold, or vehicles. It's an extremely dangerous chemical substance stored inside the lab. The game itself suggests the material has the potential to cause a catastrophe if used improperly. Trevor doesn't lead the heist, but he's knowingly involved in the entire operation and also acts as the pilot responsible for extracting the team and the toxin. So in this case, he'd be charged with the theft of controlled chemical material, carrying a possible sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison and a fine of up to $500,000. Beyond that, he'd also face charges for illegal possession of a restricted chemical agent, adding 10 years in federal prison and another $250,000 fine. On top of that, there's potential terrorism involvement as the extraction pilot, which would bring charges of conspiracy for illegal transport of a chemical agent, adding 20 more years in federal prison and another possible $500,000 fine, plus transportation of hazardous material without authorization, which would add 5 years in federal prison and yet another $250,000 fine. After pulling off the heist perfectly, Trevor decides to head back to Los Santos, where he arrives at one of the most disturbing scenes in GTA 5. When he gets to Floyd's apartment, he finds Floyd and Deborah violently arguing, and the game cuts the scene, showing only the aftermath of a heated argument and tension between Trevor, Floyd, and Deborah. The game suggests that Trevor killed Floyd and Deborah. This would be considered a double second-degree murder, carrying a possible sentence of 15 years to life per victim, resulting in 2 life sentences and a possible fine of $10,000. After that, Trevor takes Wade to the strip club where he takes over the Vanilla Unicorn. To do this, he kills the club manager, which would be a second-degree murder charge, carrying a possible sentence of 15 years to life in prison, plus a $10,000 fine. He's also charged with another crime, taking over the business by force. Since after the manager's death, Trevor assumes control of the club and starts running the place through intimidation and violence. This would lead to an extortion charge with a possible sentence of up to 4 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. And on top of that, there's the charge of illegal takeover of a commercial establishment, which carries a possible sentence of up to 5 years in prison and another possible $10,000 fine. A few weeks later, Trevor shows up at Michael's house and starts talking to him about getting Brad out of prison. At that moment, they have a bit of a falling out, and Trevor kind of realizes that Michael has been lying to him for years. Because of that, he decides to head to North Yankton to find out the truth. In this case, the first crime Trevor commits is stealing Michael's car, which would lead to a vehicle theft charge, punishable by 3 years in prison and a possible fine of up to $10,000. After stealing a plane to get to North Yankton without the owner's permission, and since that vehicle doesn't seem to belong to Trevor, this would also result in a charge of aircraft theft with up to 10 years of federal prison and a possible fine of up to $250,000. In North Yankton, Trevor breaks into the cemetery and opens the grave where he believed Michael was. Regardless of his intention, disturbing a grave without authorization is a crime, which would lead to a charge of grave violation, punishable by up to 3 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. There's also the charge of desecration of human remains, which carries a possible sentence of up to 1 year in prison and a fine of up to $1,000. After that, Michael arrives at the scene and there's an armed threat against him. They start sizing each other up. Even without firing a shot, the presence of the weapon makes the threat more serious, leading to a charge of armed threat with a possible sentence of up to 4 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After a few weeks without talking to Michael or Franklin, Trevor decides to show up at a moment when Michael really needs help, in the shootout at the court center. At a point where Michael is almost dying, trapped by a Merryweather helicopter, Trevor starts helping Michael by killing several soldiers. Let's put it in a conservative scenario of just 10 kills. Trevor would face second-degree murder charges with a possible sentence of 15 years per victim, life imprisonment, meaning 10 life sentences, and up to $100,000 in fines, with the possible additional charge of armed confrontation in a public place, carrying a potential sentence of up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. After that, Trevor lays low for a while and Franklin calls him up to help with a big rescue mission for Lamar out in the Paleto Bay countryside. Even though the main goal is to save a friend, the way things go down leads to some seriously heavy criminal consequences. In other words, Trevor is basically involved in an armed break-in followed by a massacre. This brings a second-degree murder charge for every victim he kills. Sticking with the conservative approach used throughout the video, let's say Trevor is responsible for only 10 deaths. That alone would mean 10 life sentences and up to $100,000 in fines, plus a possible additional charge of conspiracy to commit armed violence, which could add up to 5 more years in prison and an extra $10,000 in fines. After that, Trevor takes part in the big heist at the Union Depository. Trevor is involved in the planning, preparation, and execution of the biggest robbery in Los Santos history. Regardless of the approach chosen, he's one of the masterminds behind the criminal conspiracy, which already gets him the first charge: conspiracy to commit federal robbery with up to 20 years in federal prison and a possible fine of up to $250,000. But it gets worse because the gold that was stolen belonged to the National Reserve. So he also faces the charge of theft of federal property, which adds another 20 years in federal prison and a possible fine of up to $1 million. And for possession and transportation of the stolen federal property, he'd get an additional 10 years in federal prison and another $250,000 in fines. During this heist, there's an intense shootout with Merriweather where, during the getaway, he has to take out those soldiers. Depending on the approach, Trevor may or may not be directly involved in the firefight, but either way, in all approaches, he's involved in those homicides. So let's say here that he took part in the shootout, which would be the stealth option, a conservative choice of just 10 Merriweather soldiers killed. That would bring a charge of homicide during organized crime with a possible sentence per victim ranging from 15 years in prison up to life imprisonment, which would mean 10 life sentences and up to $100,000 in fines. And Trevor knows perfectly well that the stolen gold can't just be deposited into a bank account. The whole crew depends on Lester to convert the stolen gold into clean money so it looks legit, and he agrees to take part in this scheme and gets his cut, fully aware of the criminal origin of the fund. That would also bring money laundering charges with a possible sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison and fines up to $500,000, or even double the amount of money moved illegally, which would be insanely expensive, so we won't even consider that part. And after pulling off the big heist, there's one last mission where Trevor basically leads a massacre, killing agents from the FIB, Merriweather operatives, and cops too. Because during the ambush organized by Lester, agents tied to the FIB show up to take out the main crew. Trevor jumps right into the shootout, taking down several federal agents. In this conservative scenario, let's say only 10 agents are killed, which would mean a possible sentence of 15 years per victim, life imprisonment, adding up to 10 life sentences and up to $100,000 in fines. There are also multiple Merriweather soldiers killed, which would, in a conservative estimate, be 10 soldiers dead as well, each carrying 15 years to life imprisonment per victim, totaling another 10 life sentences and fines up to $100,000. After taking out the soldiers and federal agents, Trevor moves on to go after Steve Haynes directly, who's a federal agent caught on camera down at the pier. This crime is super serious because the victim is a highly decorated federal agent, but the punishment is basically the same since it falls under the charge of killing a federal agent, with a possible sentence ranging from 15 years up to life imprisonment, plus a potential fine of up to $10,000. Next, Trevor goes after Devin Weston. After killing the mansion's security guards, Trevor captures Devin and puts him in the trunk of the car. The first charge here would be 8 years in prison for kidnapping and a fine of up to $10,000. However, Trevor beats up Devin Weston once he arrives at the spot where he's waiting for Franklin and Michael, which would also count as assault and false imprisonment of Devin Weston, with the charge of aggravated assault adding another 4 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000, and false imprisonment, which would add up to 3 years in prison plus another $10,000 fine. It all culminates with Devin Weston's murder, since in the end, Trevor, Michael, and Franklin push the car with Devin Weston inside off the cliff. The car crashes, explodes, and Devin dies. This would be treated as planned homicide, resulting in a final charge of first-degree murder, which carries a sentence ranging from 25 years to life in prison, plus a fine of up to $10,000. And adding up all the crimes Trevor has already committed on this land, look guys, I put it here in an extremely conservative scenario. If I went with the worst case, it would be way worse, but just counting fixed sentences in years of prison, he'd get 895 years of prison time. Possible fines would add up to about $14,589,000 and a total of 222 life sentences. Drop a comment below if you got even close to that, because honestly, compared to Franklin's, this one got insanely crazy, more than double the years in prison and almost double the life sentences. To be honest, I don't even know how Michael's is gonna turn out. And if you like this, I ask you to click right here next to the yellow arrow where you'll see how long Franklin would be locked up if he got caught by the cops. It's way less than Trevor's, but it's pretty cool to watch too. And that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe. See you in the next video. Take care and peace out.